For the December 2012 Sunflower Stores exam question, here's how students can prepare effectively. Key areas to focus on: audit risks. Identify risks related to revenue recognition, inventory valuation, and any significant accounting estimates. Be ready to explain how these risks could lead to material misstatements. Internal controls. Evaluate the effectiveness of Sunflower Stores' internal controls, particularly around inventory management and sales processes. Substantive testing. Prepare to design substantive procedures for areas like revenue, purchases, and inventory. Ensure you can test for accuracy, completeness, and cut-off. Inventory challenges. Consider issues such as obsolete stock, inventory valuation, and year-end counts. Be familiar with audit procedures for verifying inventory quantities and cost. Financial statement assertions. Apply assertions like occurrence, valuation, and completeness when analyzing specific balances or transactions. We are going to look at a question from the December 2012 exam titled Sunflower Stores. This is question 3 in the exam and covers the syllabus areas of planning, audit risk, and internal audit, and is for 20 marks. There are 1.8 minutes for every mark in this exam, and therefore this question in total should take you no more than 36 minutes to complete. To successfully complete this question, we need to plan our answer carefully and consider the time allocated for each section, use the scenario, and have clear and efficient communication. It may be worth pausing this audio to print out the exam question at this point so you can follow the scenario as we talk through it. There is a considerable scenario to digest. I would first look at the requirements to establish what we need to look for in the scenario. It helps to know what you're looking for when reading, especially given the time you have in exam conditions. The next step is to read through the scenario from start to finish, looking out for the elements that are going to help you answer each requirement. Making notes next to paragraphs and highlighting or underlining words as you go will help you set out a plan and prepare you for starting your answer. Let's start breaking down the requirements. Part A asks us to list 5 sources of information that would be of use in gaining an understanding of Sunflower Stores. And for each source, describe what you would expect to obtain. Half a mark will be allocated for each source that an auditor can use to gain information at the planning stage. A further half a mark is then given if you can explain what information you would expect to obtain from this source. The marking scheme is strict in that you cannot obtain more than 2.5 marks for sources and 2.5 marks for the type of information you would get. This requirement is for 5 marks, and therefore no more than 9 minutes should be spent on this. Part B asks us to describe 5 audit risks and explain the auditor's response to each risk in planning the audit of Sunflower Stores. We see this style of question in every exam. Audit risk is a very important part of the planning process, and indeed the audit process as a whole. It has therefore been communicated by the ACCA to expect to see this every time. There is 1 mark available for each well-explained audit risk. A further 1 mark is then awarded for explaining how the auditor would respond to the risk by way of the work they would need to do. There are 5 audit risks to describe, with 5 corresponding auditor responses. This gives us a 10-mark question where no more than 18 minutes should be spent before moving on. It is worth noting that half a mark will be awarded for identifying from the scenario the potential audit risk. You will only get the remaining half a mark if you can then explain why it is a risk to the audit. Many candidates explain the risk as a business risk to the client and therefore get no further marks. The auditor's response is to explain the work that the auditor would need to do to address the audit risk. 1 mark will be awarded for a well-explained auditor's response to the risk you have identified. There are often several things you could do in relation to a particular risk. Only 1 mark will be allocated, so do not waste time on describing lots of ideas. Stick to an example and explain it properly. For parts A and B, they are asking for 2 things within each requirement. A presentation tip is to split your answer into 2 columns, with headings showing what you are answering. This will help the marker identify what you are answering, and it will also help you remember to include everything to give yourself the best chance of gaining the marks. For part A, on one side of the page you can head up sources of information, and on the other, the heading, what you expect to obtain. For part B, on one side of your answer you can head up audit risk, and on the other side, auditor's response. Part C asks us to describe the factors the finance director should consider before establishing an internal audit department. This is a 5-mark requirement, and we need to describe the 5 things the finance director should think about to get all the marks. Once again, we can use a scenario to gain specific ideas that would concern this particular company, and can also use our knowledge from the syllabus to help us. No more than 9 minutes should be spent on this part of the question. Now, let's look at the question in detail. Part A is a knowledge question where very little can be obtained from the scenario. In this case, you obtain the answer from your textbook studies, and either you know it or you don't. At the planning stage, we will have access to the client's books and records, and will have other sources of information available to us. This will help the auditors gain an understanding of the client. Let's outline the 5 sources of information I will use to answer this question. Number 1. Last year's financial statements. Number 2. The current year's budgets and management accounts for Sunflower Stores. Number 3. Sunflower Stores website. Number 4. The management of Sunflower Stores. And number 5. Last year's audit file. Stating 5 of these would give you 2.5 marks in the exam. You will need to describe what you will expect to obtain from the source, and this will give you the remaining 2.5 marks. Last year's financial statements. By reviewing last year's published financial statements, we can identify Sunflower Store's size, the accounting framework they've used, and by reading the disclosure notes, it will give us information on events that may have an impact on the current year. The current year's budgets and management accounts. This gives us the current financial information. It will help the auditor identify significant changes from the previous year, and they can use analytical procedures to identify areas where the auditor should focus, including potential audit risks. The client website. The website will hold information about the structure of the company, including the number of stores, and will include information on news, for example, new stores, which will help the auditor consider as potential audit risks. Client management. The auditors can have discussions with management to identify changes and other relevant information for the audit. They can also review minutes of board meetings for evidence of plans and events that may need to be included in the financial statements. Last year's audit file. It is always useful to see what was found by the auditors in the previous year and how they were resolved. It will help understand the directors and any potential problems that may reoccur. There may also be points to bring forward to our current year, which the auditor should address. Now we have our 5 sources. You should ensure you clearly show the 5 separate points. This could be by including headings and leaving gaps between each source. Be clear with your explanation of what information you expect to gain from the source, and 4 marks can be achieved. Now, let's turn back to the scenario for the remainder of the question. As you read through the scenario, you'll be able to identify areas that relate to specific requirements. You can highlight and reference these to each requirement as you go. Planning of these answers is important. Part of your allocated time should be spent structuring. This will make writing out your answers easier and faster once you get started. Part B will use the scenario extensively. We must identify audit risks from the scenario, and then also explain how the auditors respond to these risks. We can format our answer in 2 columns. We have 5 audit risks to find and explain. However, there are typically more than this in the scenario. My advice is to identify as many as possible when reading through the scenario. I suggest pausing this audio and doing this now, so we can work through how to formulate the answer together. If you are struggling to find enough audit risks, this would suggest a lack of preparation for this area. Reading through your notes on this area would be highly recommended before trying to identify the audit risks again. If you have found plenty of audit risks in the scenario, your next milestone is to be able to explain the audit risk properly. This is where typically most candidates fall down in the exam. For us to explain an audit risk properly, we need to know what an audit risk is. An audit risk is the risk of the auditor producing an inappropriate opinion on the financial statements. For example, stating that the financial statements are true and fair when they are not. For this to happen, there would be a material misstatement present in the financial statements, causing balances to be overstated or understated. Or, disclosure in the financial statements that may be inadequate. When we prepare our answer, we need to include 2 things: the audit risk we have found in the scenario, and the impact it has on our audit and the financial statements. It should not include the impact it has on the client's business. Audit risk relates to the risks of the auditor, not client business risks. We should then describe the auditor's response to such a risk. This would be an explanation of the type of work the auditor would need to do to ensure misstatements are identified and that disclosures are sufficient and appropriate. Now, based on my review of the scenario, let's go through my 5 audit risks and responses. There has been $1.6 million spent on refurbishment for all supermarkets. The warehouse has been disposed of at a profit. There has been $1.5 million borrowed from the bank over 5 years. Sunflower stores have inventory counts across all stores and the warehouse on the same day. And individual supermarkets have produced their own financial records for the previous year. The $1.6 million refurbishment costs. These refurbishment costs may be a mix of capital and revenue expenditure. There is a risk that expenses have been capitalized in error, overstating non-current assets, and overstating profit. The appropriate auditor's response would be to carefully review the breakdown of costs incurred and inspect invoices. We need to agree where they have been allocated to ensure capitalized costs fit the criteria of IAS 16. The warehouse disposal. If the warehouse has been disposed of, it needs to be removed correctly from the ledger and the non-current asset register. There is a risk that if not done correctly, assets and the register may be overstated. The profit also needs to be recorded properly. The appropriate auditor's response would be to inspect the property, plant and equipment accounts to ensure the asset has been removed correctly, also inspecting the asset register for its update, and agree the profit on disposal has been correctly accounted for. The $1.5 million loan. The loan is to be repaid over 5 years. We need to ensure that the split between what is due within and after 1 year has been disclosed correctly in the statement of financial position. The auditor's response could be to identify if Sunflower received the loan and obtain the loan statement, recalculating what is due within 1 year, and agree the split in the financial statements. Inventory counts. Planned Simultaneous counts over all 25 stores and the warehouse may leave it difficult for the auditor to attend them all. There is a risk that inventory may be overstated and not detected by the auditor. An auditor's response would be to select a sufficient and appropriate sample of stores to attend year-end inventory counts. The sample should include larger stores and the new warehouse. Opening balances. The stores have transferred opening balances onto the new central system. There is a risk that these have not been transferred correctly, and opening balances may contain several misstatements. The auditor's approach would be to discuss with management the process they used to transfer the data, and assess how likely it is misstatements could be present. For a sample of stores, they can agree balances to the store records. There were many others you could have found, and the ACCA suggested answer gives you plenty to review. The key is to stick to the requirements. Identify and select 5 you feel most comfortable writing about, and then explain how they cause an audit risk. Use headings, space out your answer, and explain clearly both parts. Part C is again using the scenario and our knowledge. We must describe the factors the finance director should consider before establishing an internal audit department. This is for 5 marks, and so 5 things the director should consider is our aim. An internal audit department would be working for the management of sunflower stores. They can have a varied role, and it's worth remembering some of the typical duties to then think about sunflower's considerations. These include the following: reviewing control activities, identifying business risks for the company, examining legislation that the company should follow, value for money audits, working with and supporting the audit committee, and special investigations such as fraud. With this in mind, we need to consider whether sunflower stores would benefit from having an internal audit department, and what would be the concerns of management before setting up this department. The biggest concern is typically the cost. To employ a team or even an individual internal auditor, it's going to be a considerable amount. Sunflower stores management should perform a cost-benefit analysis to identify if the benefits for them are going to outweigh the costs. Control deficiencies may also be a concern to Sunflower, especially as they have so many sites to review. There may be departments where control deficiencies have been highlighted by the external auditors. Sunflower would then benefit from an internal audit department who can then review and implement changes. The structure of an organization should also be considered when deciding whether to form an internal audit function. Sunflower operates from 25 stores and a central warehouse. The bigger the organization with multiple sites, then the more it is likely to benefit from an internal audit team. Sunflower would appear to benefit from this. Fraud is also likely to be a concern for the management. Sunflower stores had individual stores and a warehouse holding a lot of inventory. The risk of theft, both internally and externally, is likely to be a concern, and so internal auditors can review this and identify changes if needed. Finally, for our 5th point, we could mention whether there is some of this work already being carried out within the company. If there are skills available within the current workforce, it may not be necessary to set up an internal audit department. And so, the 5 factors to consider are cost, whether control deficiencies need attention, size and complexity of the organization, the risk of fraud, and where the skills are already present to do the work. In summary, each requirement needs to be answered within the time allocation to give yourself the best chance to complete all the questions. Careful planning of the structure of your answer is needed. Include clear headings to introduce your answer. Structure with columns when the requirement asks for multiple pieces of information. And this all helps improve the speed and efficiency of your answer. Finally, wherever possible, use the scenario. This information has been given to you for a reason, And at F8, they are testing whether you can apply your knowledge to a new situation, and not just whether you can remember the facts from your studies. I hope you found this audio useful. Thank you for listening.